Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A warm welcome, dear viewers, to this edition of Mena Watch Talks. My name is Florian Markel, and this is a continuation of the series about what's currently happening in Syria. We began this series over a year ago, even before Assad's fall, and have consistently continued it at irregular intervals ever since. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Thomas von der Osten-Sacken as our guest again today. We've had the pleasure of speaking with him multiple times already in this series. In fact, just last week he connected with us all the way from Istanbul. This time we welcome him in Süleymaniye, northern Iraq. So thank you so much, Thomas, for making the time for us again. The ceasefire, which was declared between the government forces and the SDF and announced last week, was initially intended to last only 4 days. However, it has now been prolonged. And what other agreements were made then, and where do all the developments stand at this very moment?
Yes, as I said at the last minute yesterday evening at 11 p.m. our time, it was announced that they are extending it for 15 days. I believe this was primarily due to pressure from the Americans, as the Islamic State prisoners, who had been held on the Syrian side, are meant to be transferred here to Iraq. That process requires significantly more time than such a brief period would allow. So the question now is whether this will be accompanied by some kind of political process that in some kind of leads to a satisfactory solution for both sides or not. However, there are some indications that diplomatic initiatives will be undertaken and pursued significantly. So on the one hand, there is a delegation from the Kurdistan National Congress. These are, so to speak, the Kurdish parties that are not allied with the PYD, were formally invited to Damascus for talks. Last year, they had drawn up a list of demands outlining their vision for the future of Syrian Kurdistan, or Rojava. Mazlum Abdi, the head of the SDF, made some corresponding statements yesterday, and from Damascus, there were also certain signals that conveyed a similar message expressing a clear intention to avoid this escalating conflict. At the same time, however, minor skirmishes are being reported, especially south of Kobani. So, it is an absolutely fluid situation, and it remains uncertain what the coming days will hold, especially since the humanitarian situation in Kobani and Kamishli, as we hear from our partners on the ground, is proving to be utterly catastrophic. A large number of internally displaced persons have fled there from Raqqa and Hasaka. It was truly frigid over the weekend, and now there's a severe shortage of essential supplies and adequate shelter available. Therefore, the situation is extremely fraught with tension.
And how would you evaluate that? I mean, you've said the situation is quite fluid and could develop in many different directions. But is there now a genuine, well-founded hope that the large-scale escalation, which was understandably greatly feared, might actually be avoided or prevented from happening?
Well, it's incredibly difficult to assess. Perhaps just a quick glance from this perspective, because I think there are many very fundamental misunderstandings at the moment coming from various sides, and that's precisely what makes this conflict so incredibly perilous. Damascus is completely misjudging the reaction it will provoke, not just from Syrian Kurds, but now from all of Kurdistan. And conversely, I think that not only in Syrian Kurdistan, but everywhere here, people are completely misjudging the advance of the HTS because they perceive it within the context of their own history and their own profound experiences of suffering, which leads to a severe misinterpretation of the current situation. And that is something which I believe the European public and even the politicians are currently completely failing to grasp or acknowledge in any meaningful way. So, I'm currently here in Iraqi Kurdistan, where I've been working for well over 30 years, and I've truly never before witnessed such an overwhelming surge of nationalism in this region. Indeed, every single day, thousands of young people are out on the streets demonstrating for Rojava. Basically, within 10 days, people started dressing themselves in this Kurdish Germana. It's the equivalent of a keffiyeh, but specifically for this region, and with Kurdish flag designs. Kurdish flags are hanging everywhere, and Kurdish music is constantly being played. It is truly a profound awakening unfolding before our eyes. And it's not about the question now, is this the PYD? This isn't about our stance on political parties and the like. Instead, it's genuinely perceived as an attack on Kurdistan, and the resulting reaction is entirely commensurate with that perception. And this particular reaction, which is truly quite fascinating for the very first time ever, is not operating or functioning along those typical party lines. Iraqi Kurdistan is completely divided essentially by these major parties that also very heavily dominate daily life here. However, to me, it appears that what's transpiring here is almost a direct equivalent to those Gen Z protests we were discussing just last week. What that means is, young people are suddenly discovering this Kurdish identity, they're dressing in Kurdish attire, feeling as though they are all under attack, and the Syrian government is not just facing a relatively small group in Syria, if one considers it within the four parts of Kurdistan. Instead, it is now suddenly and quite literally confronting 40 million people. And the people here suddenly realize, we are 40 million strong. Something is happening in Turkey, less so in Iran because of the terrible situation there, but also here in Iraqi Kurdistan. In Iraqi Kurdistan, it's crossing all party lines, Dohuk, Erbil, Suleymaniya, and it's growing. I've also been observing these demonstrations over the past few days, and I genuinely believe this truly marks a very interesting and also a development that possesses immense explosive power within it, and this whole situation has indeed been deliberately ignited and further incited by the Syrian side. I don't think it was particularly intentional, but when the Syrian Minister of Religious Affairs during the advance when Eastern Syria published what they called the Surah al-Anfal, which means the spoils of war from the Quran, it re-traumatized the people here in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is because Saddam Hussein's large-scale extermination campaign against the Iraqi Kurds in the 80s was, in fact, known as the Anfal campaign. This means that for the people here, they want to repeat that experience. So, what happened to us here in the 80s is that now supposed to happen in Syria. Seriously? Reactions aren't particularly rational anymore. Instead, the absolute worst of suffering is being. Collective experiences of suffering, so to speak, are being reanimated, and that is precisely how people are reacting. And now, Assad is suddenly confronted with the phenomenon that it's not just a few million Kurds in northeastern Syria, but that 40 million Kurds are essentially reacting to this situation, forming a unified and formidable force against him. It's exactly the same situation with Kobani. For all Kurds, no matter what transpires there, Kobani stands as a truly symbolic location where they heroically resisted the Islamic State, and the fact that now, bearded, Allahu Akbar, shouting troops who formerly belonged to Al-Qaeda are now standing at the very gates of Kobani, and the real possibility of a new siege has ignited this intense and extremely strong reaction. And I think that's something that the people in Damascus completely and utterly underestimated, because if we try to view this whole escalation from Damascus's perspective, it's vital to grasp that Syria is, in essence, quite split into two distinct parts divided by its internal dynamics. So the heartland of Syria is situated along that main highway connecting Aleppo and Damascus with its western side extending towards Lebanon. And the entirety of eastern Syria is almost like a foreign country to most of its inhabitants. This starts even with the Arabs in eastern Syria, who all speak an Iraqi dialect because all these tribes in eastern Syria are historically much more connected to Iraq than to western Syria. And from Damascus's point of view, Qamishli or Hasaka. Those are just some provincial cities in the northeast that they ultimately have very little contact with. Kurds live there just like Alawites and Druze live elsewhere. And now it's about the so-called unification of the Syrian state, in essence. And they're trying to accomplish that militarily. However, the fact is that in Syria, the absolute geographical outpost where 40 million Kurds reside could provoke such a powerful reaction from these 40 million Kurds that completely blindsided them. They absolutely did not anticipate such an intense response. Also, that this conflict internationalized so incredibly fast, leading to such reactions here in Iraq, and it precisely leads to such reactions. Correspondingly in Turkey, where civilians attempted to cross the border in solidarity with the Kurds on the Syrian side, And with that, suddenly, Kurdistan as an actor steps onto the stage in a way that truly hasn't existed before as a unified entity. This is because Kurdish parties are notoriously contentious amongst themselves, and of course Kurds reside across 4 distinct nations, not to mention the fact that they are historically much more connected to Iraq than to West Syria. And for a very, very long time, Syria had actually played no significant role in Kurdish politics whatsoever. I still think so. It's important to consider from a Kurdish standpoint that the Syrian Kurds always functioned as an extension. Sister parties were established there, such as the PYD for the PKK or the KDP Syria, stemming from Iraq's KDP, and they were expected to simply do what the mother party desired. But now, all of a sudden, this Syrian region, once the smallest and most insignificant part of Kurdistan, has united the remaining territories. It has surprisingly taken on a very, very, very central role in Kurdish perception and political affairs. And that's new. I've really never experienced anything like it to this extent. I mean, I've sat through almost every crisis of the last 30 years on the ground.
You already mentioned in our last conversation that especially young Kurds were setting out from Iraq, making their way into Syria or intending to cross the border to somehow defend the Syrian Kurds against, and this is where everything gets unfairly lumped together, the ISIS henchmen of the Assad regime, which of course is utterly nonsensical and so on. Has that continued, or is it still happening now, or was that rather just a symbolic surge in the very first shockwave, so to speak, in light of the unfolding events?
Well, right. At the moment, last Tuesday, it truly seemed as though the military situation was on the verge of spiraling completely out of control. So the really important question in Syria is, are they advancing into what's known as the core territory of the old cantons? Which I think Ahmed also clearly articulated in his conversation with you. There's a truly vast difference between the region that the PYD and SDF controlled and what was known as the original Rojava, a significant distinction. 60% of the territory that has now been captured is historically Arab tribal land in the east, and traditionally, absolutely no Kurds have ever lived there. So right now it's genuinely about the remaining Kurdish core centers. That's Kamishli, a portion of Hasaka, and Kobani situated right up along the border, specifically within the Turkish-Iraqi-Syrian border region. The Sharaa troops stopped right before that, didn't they? So if they were to continue moving forward,
yes, that's also important to say, because in the reporting and also in the political statements on this, everything is completely lumped together and partly completely misrepresented. Thus, even when reports emerged of clashes between government troops and the SDF near Kobani, not within Kobani itself, but in its so-called suburbs, if one might phrase it that way, it was never stated that these locations were not Kurdish settlements, but rather Arab towns, places predominantly inhabited by Arabs indeed. So a lot of things were completely jumbled and misrepresented, making it seem as though utterly horrific massacres were currently taking place in Kurdish regions. In this specific situation, they certainly could pose a threat. And what might transpire is uncertain, but as of yet, they simply haven't materialized.
Exactly. So far, relatively few people have died. It's been a controlled conflict, you know. Well, so far, there haven't been any completely unbridled massacres from any side or anything of that sort, really. There's crime and fighting, yes, but up to this point, it has been a controlled conflict, and I can hardly imagine it either. What is clear both to the global public and to the Kurdish public here is that the PYD-SDF will valiantly defend Kobani and Kamishli, fiercely resisting any attempts to seize these vital areas. They will put up a significant fight to protect these crucial territories. There they will truly fight. Many people will die, and it will be devastating for all sides involved. Ultimately, both sides are aware of this, and honestly, for Damascus, having control over Kobani or Kamishli really isn't all that relevant. For them, Deir ez-Zor and those areas are crucial. That's where the oil wells are, inhabited mostly by Arabs. Therefore, it would be utterly foolish and frankly criminal to continue any further military operations in that region. But well, at the moment, it's hard for us to assess. Anyway, what's crucial is that this now concerns, so to speak, these initial, two of the original cantons declared by the PYD in 2012, which importantly weren't exclusively Kurdish cantons. This is because nowhere in those regions is there a Kurdish majority population in the same way as you find it here in Iraqi Kurdistan. Instead, at most, 50 to 60% of the population are actually Kurds, and the remainder consists of Christians, Arabs, Yazidis, and all the other groups you might find in Syria. I think that's always very important because it's precisely what makes finding a solution to this problem in Syria so incredibly complex. There are simply no truly compact Kurdish settlement areas, unlike in Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, right? Eastern Syria, which was controlled by the SDF, was never portrayed as Kurdistan. Instead, it was depicted as a democratic alternative for the remainder of Syria. That eventually just became an issue, a problem with two governments existing side by side in Syria, you know.
You're saying that a kind of, well, you could call it a nationalist Kurdish mobilization is taking place, the likes of which you've never seen before. But what does that mean in concrete terms? Does it lead to any implications or, let's say, unified Kurdish demands, or rather demands for a truly united Kurdistan? Or how does that manifest politically? Or is it still just too early for that right now, besides the fact that the issue of Syria is quite clearly dominating or occupying everyone's minds?
Well, I think for now. So a colleague of mine actually made a joke yesterday saying al-Sharaa is the first politician who has truly united the Kurds. We ought to put up statues of him in our cities. There's some truth to that, you know. So suddenly there's this feeling which is quite palpable that we are in fact 40 million people, and when we come together and act as one, we form an incredibly significant force, politically and otherwise, here in the Middle East. And what we as Kurds have attained over the past 30 years is predominantly this federal region right here in Iraq. This region isn't being disputed, and it now boasts something akin to a pan-Kurdish capital in Erbil, where significant political and diplomatic activities are actively pursued and orchestrated. And right alongside that, there was always also this other Kurdistan that existed in Syria. People didn't know it in detail, but they always knew it existed, and this Rojava simply had a historical reality for over 10-12 years, and this reality is now being called into question. And people are resisting this questioning of the very existence of the second Kurdistan. It lacks details, and you can see it too. The classic slogans are "Save Rojava" and 1 + 1 = 2. The classic slogans are "Save Rojava" and 1 + 1 = 2. So we're talking about two Kurdistans here, and something absolutely must be preserved on the Syrian side. It simply cannot just vanish so that it leaves no trace, you know. Nothing remains of it. And that's something where, well, nationalistic sentiments and ideas, you know, they're not rational. They're not openly discussed or debated, but instead they suddenly emerge in the form of symbols, slogans, memes, music, and so on, and are currently very, 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 very strongly pronounced and prevalent. The consequences of that are incredibly hard to say. First, it's vital to confirm this is happening. So this isn't solely an internal Syrian conflict anymore. Instead, it's one that significantly affects Iraq, Turkey, and to a lesser extent Iran, considering Iran also has 10 million Kurds, right? That's something one must simply and quite soberly state from the outset. And if this conflict were to escalate, there would be strong reactions from Kurds in Turkey and within Iraq. What those will look like is extremely difficult to say at the moment, but the mood here is we're ready, with Kalashnikovs or without, to cross the border to help them. This affects all of us. Their fate is our fate. Kurdistan is under threat. These are these very strong, let's say, emotions, affects that you can smell them, you can feel them. They are everywhere right now, and this is something that Damascus also needs to be taken into consideration, because at this moment they are no longer exclusively contending with the SDF and the Syrian Kurds, are they? And now we come to a second, I think, very important issue that is very specific to Syria, and that a lot of people just don't understand. In Syria, everyone suffered immensely from the civil war. We all know what a bloodbath it was, with displacement, murder, torture, and imprisonment. It truly was 12 years of sheer horror. However, it wasn't a shared horror. Rather, it was a horror that was entirely separate and distinct. This means that in Syria, there are, in essence, two deeply tragic stories of suffering that simply do not align or harmonize with one another. So, for the majority of Syrian Arabs in the western and northern parts of the country, the primary foe was undeniably Assad. He utterly devastated half of his nation, employing chemical weapons, deploying death squads, and receiving extensive support from Russia, Lebanon, and Iran. That is, so to speak, the narrative of suffering now in Western Syria, and it's the story that people are continuously attempting to tell and articulate over and over again. However, in Eastern Syria, it's actually quite a different story. The predominantly Kurdish areas, specifically because the PYD never really engaged in a struggle against Assad, were actually spared from the extreme brutality and horrific violence of the Assad regime. They suffered massively under al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and somewhat under Turkey. This means that, well, now neither side grasps that each of these individual stories of hardship has the exact same justification and validity. Instead, they harbor the feeling that the other side is actively collaborating with those who are our perpetrators, our oppressors. So, for many opposition-minded Arabs, including those who have absolutely nothing to do with Islamism, the PYD is seen as a political party that openly collaborated with Assad. Therefore, they are essentially the enemy. Conversely, for the Kurds, al-Sharaa, formerly al-Qaeda, is someone who was with al-Qaeda, and there's not much distinction made between al-Qaeda and ISIS. So now, the very enemies from back then are reappearing. This means that those who are, so to speak, the victims of their own horrific pasts now appear as veritable reincarnations of the opposing side's enemy. And that, unequivocally, is absolutely fatal, a truly disastrous outcome. There are very few connecting bridges, and that's a significant difference from, say, Iraq. There, Kurdistan was ravaged, but the Shia in southern Iraq, predominantly a Shia population, also endured immense suffering under Saddam's regime. Thus, for someone from Basra or Nasiriyah, it's quite clear what Halabja was, the terrible poison gas attacks here in Kurdistan, and who the perpetrator was, Saddam Hussein. That is what's currently missing in Syria. And we also notice this in the propaganda, how it escalates mutually. So one side says, you are collaborators with Assad, you want to divide the country, and you are the enemies of the Syrian revolution, while the other side says, you are the reincarnations of the Islamic State, and you want a new genocide, you want to annihilate us, and so on and so forth. And I think these two key factors make this conflict incredibly perilous at this moment. Firstly, there's a profound lack of understanding. One side fails to recognize that the other side has endured equally severe suffering, though perhaps from different causes, and that this suffering possesses identical legitimacy, which cannot simply be denied. And also, for al-Sharaa, as a classical, somewhat pan-Arab influenced Sunni Islamist, the Kurds are perceived as merely a Syrian minority, a view that shapes his ideology and actions significantly. But the Kurds are far more than that. They are part of a nation of 40 million people that he is currently taking on. And with that, this conflict takes on a dimension that many people simply don't grasp or even begin to comprehend. And I don't believe this is truly understood by anyone, not by Thomas Barrack, who serves here as the special envoy for the Americans, and certainly not by the Europeans. Many key players in the Middle East also fail to grasp this, because ultimately these are very potent, yet fundamentally irrational emotions that are colliding, leading to an incredibly explosive situation. It holds an incredible potential for explosion. That's in answer to your question. If something truly escalates in Kobani or Kamishli now, we are also preparing for this scenario if, for example, 100,000 refugees suddenly surge across the border, and this turns out to be a grassroots youth movement, an autonomous movement not steered by established political parties, then it becomes utterly, unequivocally impossible to predict what might unfold. What will truly happen if this escalates beyond a boiling point? If it truly reaches that 100-degree mark, and people here genuinely begin to act out of this volatile mixture of anger, fear, and re-traumatization, then things will really escalate and it could be explosive. And I really don't think any of the local political actors here would actually be able to get it under control anymore.
You did mention, of course, that if things were truly to escalate to a really significant degree in Syria, then that would inevitably have a massive impact on northern Iraq, or indeed on Iraq as a whole. Just purely out of interest, I mean, Kurdish, Iraqi Kurdistan, or Kurdistan itself, is quite a significant topic. So what exactly is the current relationship between Shahraz and the Iraqi central government? I mean, that's a government where, as everyone knows, Iran has a relatively significant amount of influence, along with Iranian militias and so forth. I'd imagine they aren't exactly on very friendly terms with each other.
I'd say al-Sharaa's best relationship is still with Barzani of the KDP, who's trying to pursue a relatively to implement a moderate political stance. For the people in southern Iraq, al-Sharaa is truly nothing more than just another face of the Islamic State. This is the ongoing, deeply rooted Sunni-Shiite conflict. One is reminded of the atrocities perpetrated by Saddam Hussein in the very name of the Sunnah. Therefore, I think for an average Iraqi Shiite, al-Sharaa represents the very personification of evil. That's why they've always supported Assad. That's been the long-standing policy. Therefore, Syria currently cannot rely on nor expect any support from Iraq. There's been a very gentle sort of rapprochement that has developed over the past year. So I think the very best contacts, as absurd as it may sound, are still maintained by Damascus with Erbil, specifically with the Kurdish Democratic Party and Barzani. They are attempting to assume an intermediary stance because they are also not, because they are actually hostile to the PKK. Therefore, there was not exactly a harmonious relationship between Rojava and the Kurdish regional government. For years, they engaged in fierce battles with the PKK in the mountains. So there, as I said, also across the rest of Iraq, these images are deeply disturbing. They are images that awaken profound fears and past traumas. And which in turn isn't really that terrible for many Syrian Arabs, because they somewhat perceived HTS as their liberators and aren't overly concerned when long-bearded militiamen are seen driving around in their jeeps. These images in turn awaken the worst fundamental fears in other parts of the Middle East.
Right, I mean, the fact that historical traumas can sort of overshadow current events or massively influence perceptions and reactions to them is something we're familiar with from other conflicts too. I'm thinking of the Yugoslav wars and the memories of World War II and the various things that happened there. Let's perhaps now turn our attention to another part of Kurdistan, if that's the proper way to refer to it. So, you see, in Iraqi Kurdistan, there are also, and not just recently, mind you, the exiled Kurdish groups originating from Iran. Now we all know what has happened in Iran in recent weeks. We've certainly discussed it already. What? So, what exactly is the situation among Iranian Kurds currently in Iraq? What exactly are they counting on? Do they want US intervention? Has the rebellion already been put down? And is there a sense of terrible despair? Or what's the general mood there at the moment?
Again, in the Middle East, nothing is ever black or white. Well, on the one hand, especially here in Sulaymaniyah, it's actually traditionally more. It genuinely belongs more to the broader Persian cultural sphere. So many families here traditionally have relatives on the Iranian side. The border's only 40 kilometers away from here, you know. What people on this side are now hearing from over there since the internet has been restored is simply absolute horror. That countless individuals have vanished, and it's unknown if they've been killed or are now imprisoned. The story, well, it's an absolute horror. And these stories are now reaching here through private contacts, tales of how piles of bodies, body bags, were left in the streets for days to intimidate people, and so on and so forth. Thus, in the Kurdish regions especially, these past 2 weeks must surely have been nothing short of a barbaric and bloody massacre, wouldn't you agree? So that's one side of it. Now to what you said. Traditionally, various Iranian-Kurdish parties, like the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the Komala, who are the communists, or the PJAK, which is somewhat linked to the PKK, maintain their bases here. They also have traditionally armed forces that they support and keep in this region, you know. And they're feeling quite optimistic at the moment. I mean, they're simply hoping they've prepared themselves by forging a larger alliance and have also established a unified military command for their forces. So they continue to hold on to hope, especially in light of this massive deployment by the USA, because if we consider everything the US is currently mobilizing in the Persian Gulf, with its aircraft carriers, defense missiles, bombers, and long-range bombers, it's quite significant. This is truly a very serious situation, what's happening. You don't do this for show. What they're doing right now costs several $100 million every day. So there's this profound hope that in the end, the US is genuinely serious about this and will in fact actually execute some form of a decapitation strike against the Iranian regime. And from time immemorial, a part of all the planning for the day after has always included the expectation that in Iran, a topic we discussed last time, the various nationalities that still possess relatively functional structures, particularly the Kurdish parties, will then prepare themselves for what's to come. They're preparing to do something akin to what occurred here in Iraq in 1991 or 2003, crossing the border, attempting to swiftly control as much territory as possible, and then establishing a governmental structure equivalent to the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, whose backing they would likely secure, because the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran has very close ties to the Kurdish Democratic Party here. They are, in essence, sister parties, which would be incredibly crucial for Iran's future planning. This is because one could reasonably assume that among the regions where peace and stability could be established fairly swiftly, Kurdistan stands out as a prime candidate. There are logistics from here, and on the one hand, that would be a retreat area if heavy confrontations or similar situations occurred in other parts of Iran where people could flee. This is also important in relation to Turkey to say that we have an internal escape alternative so 3 million people won't flee across your border. And from that point onwards, the goal would then be to create these regions of stability. And because the local Iranian-Kurdish parties have been preparing for this for some time now, there's naturally a certain excitement, I would say, or even a sense of eager anticipation that this might finally work out after such a long period, eventually leading to liberation or freedom on the other side. That one finally attains on the other side a sense of liberation or perhaps freedom after all this time. But this is, of course, interesting now as we discuss Kurdish politics, because there are these highly significant Kurdish parties. This would certainly have to be for the Americans, who have always shown interest in such scenarios because, and this is absolutely crucial, the great fear in the West is what transpires afterward. Instability, civil war, and so forth. And we simply know from Iraq that the Kurdish parties have always championed stability, advocating for Iraqi unity. They've consistently been quite reliable contacts, and the Iranian Kurds are presenting themselves similarly. So this isn't a model of socialism, self-governance, anti-imperialism like you see more in Rojava, but rather they are oriented towards the Iraqi model. But if Kobani falls now, and as I said, this entire group, all 40 million, suddenly feel like they're under attack, at the same time, if you don't come to their aid and just let it happen, from a Western perspective, it becomes very, very difficult to then say, yes, but we'll now collaborate with you in Iran as partners and so on. Because regardless of the truth or falsehood of the matter, should Rojava fall now, it would be universally perceived across Kurdistan as a profound betrayal by the West. This holds true completely independent of the political ramifications. Affiliation is. So if the US truly intends to instigate a regime change in Iran right now, they're in dire need of Kurdish backing both from the Kurdish parties in this region and from the Kurds residing in Iranian Kurdistan. And purely from that strategic calculation alone, it would be utterly suicidal and deeply self-destructive to permit Rojava to devolve into some kind of massacre. Wouldn't you agree?
All right, well, with that question, we are certainly venturing into the realm of pure fortune-telling now, because whatever considerations or lack of them are being made by a certain resident of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, whether they're currently being hired or not, I've completely given up speculating about that by now. But you mentioned it earlier. What the Americans have assembled there isn't something one does just to demonstrate a little bit of strength. No, one does that to accomplish something substantial, and not simply to just to brag or show off. It's for a genuine purpose.
Yeah, exactly. I saw this mentioned in one of those military blogs I follow. I have to track all this from here because we've got quite a few employees, many of whom are stationed directly on the Iranian border. And as an organization, we're currently operating in a bit of an emergency mode as both borders are presently becoming somewhat problematic, with us watching what happens if refugees cross the border. And on the other hand, what if things blow up in Iran? Therefore, I currently also have to deal with this professionally to some extent. Well, I read somewhere that on the Navy and on the planes, they've actually amassed more forces there now than they did back in 2003, for instance. This means what's truly happening now, not in terms of ground troops, but concerning the vessels and aircraft that are currently being brought into the region each and every day without fail. This, in terms of quantitative hardware, is a very clear and undeniable statement that we are now going to take decisive action, a truly significant step forward. Otherwise, a few bombers in Qatar or Diego Garcia would be enough. Then you wouldn't need to move the Abraham Lincoln there to clarify things with Israel. There have been extremely high-level discussions. The head of CENTCOM just departed Israel today, which also signals that the agreements with Israel have now been finalized, essentially concluded. Therefore, if someone other than Donald Trump were to be residing in Washington, D.C. at this moment, who is completely unpredictable, you could actually say, yes, it's now just a matter of days until it kicks off, and the Iranians are behaving accordingly. Therefore, Khamenei is in the bunker. The entirety of the Iranian air defense system is on the absolute highest alert level imaginable. Therefore, the Iranians are getting ready for a military strike. In Israel, it seems they're also starting to make initial preparations. We keep wondering, how long will there be air traffic still? And over the weekend, all flights to this region were also suspended. Today, they're on the move once more. If it wasn't Trump, I would assert from the past 30 years' experience, there's a 90% likelihood of a significant assault on Iran within the next 2 weeks. But with Trump sitting in Washington, that statement really becomes utterly meaningless and worthless because you simply cannot accurately assess what might or might not happen there at all. It's completely unpredictable. From that view, as I said, from the...
Yes, his latest statements yesterday were again, yes, we stand ready for everything, but he hopes it won't be necessary to deploy it. So it's that same old.
Well, much of that could certainly be attributed to the fog of war. However, what I can definitively state, given my extensive and long-standing connections to these Iranian-Kurdish parties and organizations, is that they are genuinely poised and prepared to make their move across the border. That means they are mobilized. And they are mobilized because they have been, it has been signaled that, to express it diplomatically, it would be extremely prudent to take action at this very moment. This means that in the military and political spheres, there are numerous actors who are currently working in a somewhat concerted effort towards making the plans for a regime change in Iran more concrete. They are certainly moving quite strongly in that direction, pushing for a more definitive outcome and actively developing these strategies. I believe one can cautiously state that much. One can only truly hope for it now. Considering all that has transpired in Iran, I think we're really at a critical juncture. Honestly, back in 2009, people were already saying enough is enough. Yet, the information emerging from Iran now, detailing the horrific bloodbaths that have occurred, truly brings us to a point where one exclaims, enough is enough. It's truly finished. Or, as an Iranian acquaintance of mine put it, and if the devil overthrows Khamenei, then I will become a devil worshipper.
Renas, out of pure factual interest, in prior protest elections, the Iranian regime consistently claimed that these were all subversives, the Americans and Israelis naturally, but also certain insurgent separatist Kurds who were somehow instigating the unrest. And there were often attacks by the Revolutionary Guards on Kurdish positions in northern Iraq. Such events haven't occurred this time around, if my observations are correct.
Not massively, no. And I also believe that all of this, the sheer quantity and the brutal quality of how the protests have been suppressed in recent weeks, have escalated to a point where none of those details truly matter anymore. It's perfectly clear that this regime has waged war against its own population, and on a massive scale, comparable only to Saddam's suppression of the uprisings in southern Iraq in 1991 or something like that, where you're genuinely willing to simply shoot down and massacre tens of thousands of your own citizens right there in the streets and even stab them to death with machetes. It's truly a horrifying situation. The images that are coming out of Iran are absolutely indescribable. You also can't share them anywhere on social media because you'll immediately be demoted or flagged for brutality. And they have simply crossed the Rubicon, no turning back. And I think from the Iranian perspective, it's completely irrelevant now. There's simply a state of war now, even for the people sitting here or elsewhere. And now the only question that remains is, how can we get rid of this regime as quickly as humanly possible? And no matter what comes next, it absolutely has to go.
So the most recent reports, to further illustrate this point, even from British newspapers cited sources within the Iranian Ministry of Health, stating that in just 2 days, close to 30,000 people were tragically murdered by the regime during the suppression of the protests. This is a horror and a scale that is truly unimaginable to comprehend.
Ja, ich würde sagen, dann hoffen wir mal, dass nicht in beiden Fällen, sagen wir mal, der Worst Case eintritt und ihr in irakisch.
Yes, I'd say, let's just hope the worst case scenario doesn't unfold in both instances and that you in Iraqi Kurdistan don't find yourselves caught between both sides, fearing for your homes as if they were just playthings.
Ja, dann lassen wir das mal so stehen. Herzlichen Dank, Thomas, dass du dir wieder so viel Zeit für uns genommen hast. Das war wieder mal sehr erhellend. Und für Sie, liebe Zuschauer, wie immer, herzlichen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit. Falls Ihnen dieses Video gefallen hat, dann kommentieren Sie gerne darunter, abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal, lassen Sie den berühmten Daumen hoch da. Und ansonsten sehen wir uns bei der nächsten Ausgabe des Mena Watch Talks.
Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.